Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of Radical Candor and Just Work.
And I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast. And you may have read with horror, as we did here at Radical Candor, about another upsetting trend in the workplace. The oops, just kidding job offer. There was a recent article in the Los Angeles Times where some companies are rescinding job offers and then blaming the economy. And in some cases, people had accepted these offers. They'd already upended their lives, moved across the country, only to learn there was no job there. The LA Times writes that this trend is being blamed on, quote, fears of a recession combined with upheavals in industries such as crypto, financial services, and tech. So in season 3, we had done an episode where we focused on how to choose a radically candid boss for job seekers who, along with us, did not want to pay the asshole tax. And so we're going to look at it from the other perspective today. We're going to focus on how managers can integrate radical candor into their hiring process so that they can build and sustain great teams. Before we're going to get into the details of what we found works, what doesn't work when it comes to hiring, Kim and Jason, are you feeling like there's anything new here in what we're seeing with this rescinding of offers, or is this just another cyclical occurrence with maybe a new name and a new term? What do you think?
I think rescinding of offers is nothing new. I've seen it happen many, many times, unfortunately. And one recommendation I would make to folks is if you're going to move across the country, make sure that you put in your contract that they will pay for you to move there. And if you get fired or if they rescind the offer, they'll pay for you to move back. Don't get stranded. I know several people who've been stranded in a place they didn't want to be because of a rescinded job offer, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would add to that there's definitely an extreme version of job offer rescinding, which is the one that you're describing, Kim, where you've already packed up and you've moved across the country. There's also the slightly less disruptive version of job offer rescinding where you don't have to relocate, but like you leave a job to join a company. It's really hard to go backwards. I think while this is nothing new, I do think there's a reaction to the sort of news of layoffs that's causing people to become very concerned about spending money. And I will say that there's an alternative trend, which is that smaller organizations that maybe haven't grown as quickly or produced as many job offers are hiring, and they're getting access to a larger pool of talent because of these other things. So if you're in the position where you are growing steadily and you can confidently hire new people, well, all these rescinded offers mean that the pool of applicants is going to be even better, higher quality.
Interestingly, according to ZipRecruiter, even though news about mass layoffs, especially in tech, it's been dominating the headlines at the end of 2022, continuing to do so in 2023. 2022 was actually the year with the lowest number of layoffs and employee discharges that were recorded in official Labor Department data. Going back to 2000, there was a monster survey that was released this January finding that 92% of employers surveyed said they're planning to hire this year. Of course, it's coming from Monster. So, there's that data. But I think that's a really interesting statistic. 92% of employers surveyed said they plan to hire, with close to half backfilling roles. So we're going to talk about hiring, how to make a more radically candid, compassionately candid hiring process. Kim, your book, Radical Candor, in which you write, quote, some companies don't invest much time in the hiring process on the theory that it's easy to fire people. This is a big mistake, end quote. And so, not every possible situation can be predicted, but you do outline a hiring process that can increase the chances that the right people are going to be hired at the right time. And it's so important. What we're so committed to is that remembering that the people we're hiring are real human beings with loved ones, with bills, with responsibilities. And it's not about trying people on like a pair of shoes you can discard or discharge, I guess, later if they're not the right fit. It's so important to get hiring right. And so today we want to discuss 5 key things that you've seen work and not work from your experience at Google, Apple, and elsewhere. Jason, getting your perspectives as well. One of the things I want to bring in at the top is something else that you wrote, Kim, in Radical Candor, which is, quote, These are the basic elements of a hiring process that is as rigorous as possible without being overly onerous. But you write, all hiring is flawed and subjective, and these drawbacks cannot be fixed. They can only be managed. And I know you spent a lot of time kind of revisiting this in Just Work. And so I would love to just have you share with folks how you revisited this idea of the drawbacks of hiring being flawed and subjective when you were writing Just Work.
Yeah, I think when I was writing Radical Candor, I was thinking that interviewing is flawed and subjective, and I think that's true. But there's a bunch of things that you can do before you get to the interview process that can take bias out of your hiring process. And I write about those things in Just Work. One of the things you can do is you can check your job description for bias. You can use Textio as pioneered, but there's a bunch of companies that will flag bias in your job descriptions in anything you write. And that is really important because if you read the book Corruptible, it talks a lot about how we tend to attract the wrong people by writing the wrong things in our job descriptions. And am I going to apply for a job where it tells me that, I need to be hardcore? No, I will not apply for that job. So if you want to cast a broader net, you may want to check your job descriptions. And you probably don't need to do this for all time, but if you want to find out whether or not there's bias creeping into your decision-making about who to invite in for an interview, you can strip personally identifiable information out of resumes before you invite people in. That means that the people who are reviewing the resumes to decide who comes for an interview and who doesn't don't know the person's gender, race, sexual orientation, gender identity. You strip all information out. And then you invite people in for interviews and find out, oh, this is interesting. Now that I've stripped that information out, we're inviting more diverse set of people in. If that happens, then you need to sit down and work with your sourcers to deal with bias in that part of the process. And then the next thing you can do is a skills assessment that doesn't reveal who the person is. You just are finding out if this person has the skills. The classic example of this is what happened with orchestras. In the 70s, orchestras were about 95% men. And then they started doing auditions behind a curtain, so you couldn't see who was playing. And at first, it didn't improve who was being hired. And then they realized that the women who were auditioning were wearing high-heeled shoes. And so they had people not only audition behind a curtain, but take their shoes off before they walked on the stage to play. And now orchestras are they're 50-50 roughly. So it really can work if you're just wanting to identify the skills, not the people. But then, of course, we do want to interview. And you want to interview not, I think, for culture fit, but for culture add. And it's important. There's another step here. Once you have that interview process, you need to quantify your bias again and take a look and say, okay, we have this kind of diversity coming into, and if it drops off, if you have a drop off after the interview process, there is a good chance that bias is creeping into the interview process and you need to reassess. You need to figure out what your equivalent of getting people to take their shoes off is.
Yeah. And so just to reframe what I heard you say of the elements of the hiring process. You talked about job descriptions. You talked about stripping, sort of personal information out of the resumes before getting into the interviews, doing skills assessments that don't reveal who the person is, and then interviewing for culture add. Just to go back to this checking job descriptions for bias piece that you mentioned, Jason, I think there's an anecdote from Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman that illuminates some of that. Do you want to share that reflection?
I can do it if you don't want to do it, Jason. I love this anecdote. Kahneman is writing about how to strip bias out of the interview process. And he's the one who recommended that you write down what are the criteria you're looking for that describes your culture. And then you want to make sure that you're having each person who's interviewing people assess each separately rather than having a blink reaction, because the blink reaction is where so much bias creeps in. And so that is all very good and well and important. But what was his description of what he was looking for when he was describing this? responsibility, sociability, and masculine pride. There was some bias creeping. So take a look at your criteria and make sure bias hasn't crept into your criteria. You really can't make that shit up, can you?
I think that you need to go, from my perspective, a step further beyond single word descriptors and actually describe what that looks like. I feel like there almost needs to be, at each of these stages, like whenever you're asking a question in an interview process, you want to leave room to be surprised, but you should also have an idea of what a good answer to that question looks like. And so something that I have done effectively in the past is to create sort of at least 3 buckets, which is like a failure to answer this question effectively will look like this. It will have a dearth of specific details or something along those lines. A pass will look like they can offer specific details, but they can't apply that thinking to another sort of area of or problem solving domain. And then a great response will be like, not only can they give me details, they can show that they're able to apply that thinking rigorously to another area, another domain around which they will have responsibility to solve problems. So like, even when you get down to the descriptors for culture, you should be able to say, what does responsibility look like in this culture? Yeah. What does it mean to take responsibility for something? What does sociability mean? Why does that matter? And what does it look like? Because I feel like that not only does it allow bias to creep in, you also get inconsistency between interviewers. So like if you have more than one person looking at this and you don't have a description of what it actually means, the results of the interviews become very hard to parse next to each other.
So Jason, what do you think about who should write the job description?
I'm going to quote a famous author about who should write the job description. Cam, in the book, you say that the hiring person, not a recruiter, should write the job description, basing it on the role, the skills required for the role, and the team culture criteria. Defining team culture can be hard, which makes it tempting to leave out. Try to describe your culture in 3 words. It could be detail-oriented, quirky, and blunt, or maybe it's big picture, straight-laced, and polite. Whatever you choose, be disciplined about interviewing for those things. This will help people avoid making gut decisions that are so often driven by bias. And I think because you spend more time in this particular quotation talking about the culture piece, I think the first sentence might be skipped over, but it is crucially important that recruiters and executives do not write job descriptions. The direct line manager for that role should be writing the job description.
Yeah. And I want to just be clear, like job description is going to talk about a lot more than culture ad. So the job description is going to talk about how many years experience you expect the person to have had. It's going to talk about what skills the person needs to have. It's going to explain to the person like a little bit at least about what the job is, because it's very hard to know if you want to apply for a job if you have no idea what the job is. I've applied for a lot of jobs where I'm like, I don't know what the job is, and sort of an uncomfortable feeling. But now let's talk about describing the culture in a few words.
I think what's interesting is even going back to the Daniel Kahneman story of responsibility, sociability, masculine pride. I think there's a conflation of skills and culture. Those phrases can be as much about the culture that we reward as the job description. So I don't know from that anecdote if that was specifically about the actual stuff you're doing or about the culture itself. I wanted us to talk about the culture there, but I think it's important because sometimes we conflate actual tasks with culture. And so being really clear on what the skills that are required for the job description. So going back to what we were talking about with detail-oriented, quirky, blunt, et cetera, more about the culture ad.
So Brandy, how would you describe our culture in 3 or 4 words?
I would describe it as radically candid. I think this is an organization where people walk the talk, which is really nice. I know I can speak truth to power and ask questions without feeling like I'm going to be retaliated against. Curious, creative, and casual. I think we don't have to be quote unquote professional and have a formal way to speak to each other, as in some organizations.
I can go. I think we're cheating a little to get to 4 words, but I chose compassionately candid because I feel like that gave us a lot more words. But obviously, we want to be living our mission with being both compassionate and candid. I also had creative, and I do think there's a spirit of whether it's I was struggling between the word self-starters, but where I really landed was growth, that everyone who works at Radical Candor is committed to our own growth and to supporting the growth of everyone around us and kind of all that that means. And then I did have fun/funny, again, trying to get two words with one, but just a commitment to a spirit of playfulness in the work that we do. What about you, Jason?
Yeah, I think it's sort of funny because radically candid or compassionately candid, this team, at least to me, one of the hallmarks of our relationship is that everyone here is unfailingly kind to one another. I mean that in the humanitarian way, not in the sort of like polite way. They actually care for one another. Supportive is another word that I would use to describe this culture. And I think that speaks to growth, but there's a lot of things that people on the team, some people have families and some people don't. Some people have big hobbies and interests outside of work and some people don't. But I have seen this team really deeply support the sort of like hopes and dreams, even when, and maybe especially when that extends beyond the work that we do. And then I would say committed or driven, like the balance to that is like, I feel that everybody is busting their butt to make this dream a reality. So those are my three words.
I love it. Growth mindset, I think, is important. And if I can choose a fourth, I would say honoring individuality. I mean, I think we really try to respect each other's differences and not just respect them, but honor them.
And I also love how you could get like, we're going to just call growth mindset a word. And I'm honoring your uniqueness in that. All right. So we've talked about sort of this idea of culture ads and defining your team culture and even how these words might have different meanings for different people. Kim, you did spend a good bit of time in Just Work really expanding this idea of culture ads versus culture fit. So can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, first of all, I want to credit Melissa James and we'll put the article in the show notes. Melissa James was the person who taught me anyway about culture fit in an article she wrote. And there's a ton that's been written about culture ad and our culture is not for everyone. And there's some truth to that. And also it's not totally unreasonable, but the extent to which culture fit is like a super highway for cultural bias needs to be made explicit. And that's why I like the idea of culture ad instead. We want to adapt and change and grow and improve. Part of having a growth mindset is looking for people who are going to challenge our culture and question our culture and help us make it better. And so that's why I like that so much. When I was working at Google, one of the criteria that we would look for when we interviewed was googliness, but that never got defined anywhere. And that became like the way in which people would use bias, pretend like this is objective, but it's actually bias. I mean, another common thing that people will do in their hiring process is they'll apply what they call the airport test. That means like, if you're traveling with this person and there's a 10-hour delay, are you happy to sit next to this person for 10 hours? And that is another like super highway for bias of all different sorts. So I think you want to really take a look at what you're writing down when you're describing your culture and questioning the words that you're choosing to describe your culture or the way that you're trying to assess culture ad.
I have a question. Should something about culture ad be in the job description? And I'm asking because I was having a conversation with a friend recently who was looking at a place where she could potentially bring her business. And she said, like, I don't think I fit in with these people. They're all X and I'm Y. And I saw that as like, well, that's why they need you because you're different and you can bring this different perspective. But to her, it felt like she wouldn't belong.
I think it is a better idea to make it public, to write it down publicly so that people know when they come in for an interview, what are the criteria by which they're being assessed. It was one of the things that I think was often gave some people an unfair advantage in Google interviews, for example. Google did not make it public that they were what the criteria were that was being used to assess them when they came in for an interview. And some people, when they were prepping, would talk to someone who worked at Google who would tell them. And other people didn't happen to know someone who worked at Google. And that's a way in which bias sort of compounds on itself. It was, a homogeneous organization. And so people who had friends there tended to look like people who were already there. And it was very hard to bring in culture add. I mean, another way that culture doesn't get added to is companies rely too much. And I am guilty of having done this throughout my career, but they rely too much on referrals, employee referrals. And if you have a homogeneous company and you rely for hiring on employee referrals, you're going to get, because people's personal networks tend to be homogeneous.
Jason, anything more to add on culture add?
I appreciate Brandy's question because I do think that organizations, at least in my perception, rarely speak directly to the idea that here are the types of difference or challenges that we are willing to accept. I can imagine a world in which you look at a job description, it says like, we're primarily these things, but we feel like we're missing these other things. And so we'd love to find people who can bring some new perspectives in these ways to our work. I don't think it's true that like, even if you have a fairly inclusive culture, like there may be things about the way that you work together that aren't for everyone. So it's not like you can do this universally, but I like the idea of adding some explicit call for difference to say like, we recognize that we would benefit from other experiences or sort of like cultural experiences that we don't, or attitudes that we don't currently have. And here's a couple of examples, just so that when people look at it, at least they see the door is open. They don't feel like you've defined the culture and then it's set.
Yeah, I'm realizing as we're talking that I wasn't as probably explicit as I could have been in writing either Radical Candor or Just Work about the difference. Like the job description should include the skills that in an ideal world would be tested without an interview. And it should, I think, publicly include the sort of criteria that you're looking for culture add. And all of that should be open and public and transparent in an ideal world, which this is not.
Kim, if I can ask you, since I can tell you're sort of revisiting some ideas in Radical Candor and Just Work, you had talked about doing skills assessments that don't reveal who the person is. Do you have an example of what something like that might look like?
Sure. I mean, one is the orchestra example that I gave. Another is when we were hiring for salespeople, we would get people to write pitch emails. And then the people who were assessing them didn't know who had written the emails. They just assessed the emails, the pitch email. And if you're hiring engineers, you can get people to write code and you can look at the code and not the person, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's certainly something I've done in terms of writing jobs. It's easy to get writing samples. I'm curious, did you do this as a prerequisite to getting the interview, or had people already gotten through sort of phase one of interviewing and this was to go to a next step?
I think the right order is to decide who you think you're going to bring in for an interview first, and then have them do a skills assessment and then have them do an interview. If they don't have the skills necessary, then you can save everybody a lot of time and not interview them.
Jason, what do you think of that ordering?
I think it's great, like if those are useful or semi-objective filters. I think if, depending on the sales role, it may not be the case that they spend a significant amount of time writing sales pitch emails, even though they might do that sometimes, in which case that's not actually a great filter. I think it is a great idea to do it exactly in the order that Kim has described, as long as the activity that you ask people to do is actually representative of the work they will really do. It was in my head was a lot of companies sort of read advice like this. And what they did was they put kind of a bullshit test in between the process of like sorting through resumes and actually interviewing people. And it wasn't a fair assessment. And so there was like some criteria that were used to evaluate it. It was theoretically objective, but it wasn't actually measuring something that was important to the job. And so don't make that mistake. Like only do this if you have a task that can actually be done asynchronously without revealing the person's identity that is relevant to the job.
I mean, one thing you could do, this may be a horrible idea, but like if you were going to hire salespeople who are in front of customers, so you wanted to see how they responded, you could do some sort of like Zoom call where their face and voice is masked. So you hear the words and kind of the intonation, but you could like create some little avatar if you're a big company that you could do this. And there are technologies we all know out there that allow for this kind of thing to happen. And it's not super expensive. It might not tell you anything. I don't know whether it would work or not, but it would be fun to play with.
One thing I want to add, because I've done a lot of these skills assessment for interviews, and I've actually declined to do some of them because there is a concern, especially among like writers and maybe even coders, that you're going to steal my idea. You're not going to hire me, but then you're going to take my ideas. So I think it needs to be explicit that like these will be thrown away. We will not use them. If we do use them, we will pay you for them, because there's a lot of unpaid labor that goes into some of these assessments. And then the person's like, well, I just gave them all my best ideas and I didn't get the job.
Yes, that is really important. And that does happen all the time. And it shouldn't take forever. It shouldn't be quote unquote real work that the company is going to use. And like, you shouldn't ask people to spend days interviewing. It should take half an hour or an hour.
All right. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about, Kim, one of your, if I may, I think favorite ideas, an idea that really resonates people with this idea of rock star mode or superstar mode. And so the question is, and you pose this in Radical Candor, should you be hiring people in rock star mode or people in superstar mode? And for folks who maybe haven't read the book or listened to some of our other podcasts on this, I'll just quickly define it. In Radical Candor, you write, remember, people in rock star mode are solid as a rock. Think the Rock of Gibraltar, not Bruce Springsteen. They love their work. They found their groove. They don't want the next job if it will take them away from their craft. People in superstar mode, on the other hand, need to be challenged and given new opportunities to grow constantly. So the answer is, of course, it depends. There are some jobs that require one or the other. Also, you want to make sure you have the right ratio overall on your team. If you have too many folks in superstar mode, hire someone in rockstar mode next. If you take the time to define the growth trajectory required for the role, it can help interviewers avoid one kind of hiring bias, hiring people who share your ambitions, which may not be desirable for the role. And so the written job description should then go to all interviewers so they know precisely what you're interviewing for. Kim, as you hear your words being read back, the conversation we've been having about bias, do you have anything more to add about sort of rock star, superstar ratio and modes?
Yeah, I mean, there's no right answer to what the right ratio is and what the right mode for the right role is. The thing that is universal is that you need to try to be as explicit about it as possible. So someone needs to know if they're interviewing for a job where they're expected to put in extra hours and to be gunning for the next job, where like if it's an up or out situation, someone should know that that's the case because they may not want that situation. Whereas if there's a job that is a great job, but is not going to lead to promotion, you should know that going in so that if you are gunning for that promotion, you're not going to apply for that job. You're going to look for one that is going to meet your career goals. So I think that's really important. I don't know. What do you think, Jason?
I would only add that I think it's like a real act of kindness to get clear on that, because I know that there's another narrative which persists, which is, well, just get your foot in the door and then you can grow into the role that you want. But if you get your foot in the door in a role that doesn't provide a lot of opportunities for growth, you may be sacrificing something without a high probability of getting what you want. From my perspective, a lot of the most difficult conversations I had when it came to retaining people had to do with that misalignment, the misalignment of like how much growth was actually possible given the sort of structure of the organization and the growth of the team, et cetera, et cetera. Like that misalignment was the source of a lot of frustration. So making it clear in the job description, if you can, seems like are both great for the interview process and really good for the relationship that person will eventually have with their manager.
Yeah. And I want to say this is awkward because we're so sort of agitated about promotions. Like just saying it, just being explicit about what the expectation is really helpful.
Yeah. What's coming up is you're saying that what Jason was sharing was in all of these steps, the importance of clarity. You know, I often reframe challenge directly as clear and getting more and more clear about what is our team culture? What are we rewarding? What are my own fears about this role? Do I know what good looks like? You know, really getting clear is going to be one of the best gifts you can give for this person that you're bringing on board to set all of you up for success. I really appreciate you being Jason. Sorry, so clear about it. Another thing that helps us often gain clarity is getting multiple perspectives. And Kim, in the book Radical Candor, you write, quote, because interviewing is so subjective and prone to bias, you'll improve your odds of making good decisions by getting multiple perspectives. And you talk about the need to really try to avoid unilateral hiring decisions. So can you walk us through what you think a good hiring committee looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And having a bunch of people instead of one person making the decision unilaterally will do two really good things for you. It'll help you make better hiring decisions, and it'll also help pull bias out of the process. And because it's very hard to notice one's own unconscious biases, it's easier to notice them in other people. So it's not, if you have a homogeneous hiring committee, then it's probably not going to do as good a job pulling bias out as if you have a more diverse hiring committee. So in an ideal world, everyone wouldn't look the same on your hiring committee, and it would be about 4 people. When I interviewed at Google, I think I had 27 or 28 interviews. That was too many for me, and it was too many for the organization. People were spending way too much time interviewing. So 4 people seem to be about the right number. And again, you want a diverse interviewing committee. And there's a nuance here, because if you don't have a diverse team, then you can wind up putting too many interviews on the plate of the people who are underrepresented on your team. So one thing I recommend, which is controversial, so I would love to hear your all's thoughts on it. But if you don't have a diverse team, and you want to have interview committees who are diverse, you could hire people to sit in on the committee who don't actually work at the company. You could hire kind of a bias buster for your interview committees. But again, ideally, you want a diverse committee. If you're a woman candidate, it can be off-putting if everyone who interviews you is a man. And if you're underrepresented, it can be frustrating along any dimension. It can be frustrating if everyone who interviews you is overrepresented, shall we say. So it's really helpful if at least one of the interviewers is also on another team, like will be a cross-functional peer of this person you're hiring. That can help prevent desperation hiring. Very often, if everyone on an interview committee is very acutely aware that there's a hole on their team and having to do a bunch of the extra work, and they're hoping to offload work onto this person they're hiring, they'll hire too fast. So those are some thoughts. What do you all think? Brandy, Amy, Jason?
What I'm curious about with this potentially hiring of a bias buster is how that might land for the person who's sitting there feeling like, did they bring this person in?
Bias buster is not going to interview the candidate, so it won't help the candidate feel more comfortable. The bias buster will sit and listen to the conversation about the candidate and flag biases. So for example, I think I've told this story before, but it's funny, so I'm going to tell it again. I was hired to be a bias buster. It wasn't a hiring meeting. It was a promotion meeting. And 2 people were up for promotion, a man and a woman. And the reason why they hired me to bust their bias is that this team didn't have any women on it. And so and both of these candidates for promotion had done great work and were equally well qualified. Their teams both loved them. And they referred to the man as a great leader. And then they referred to the woman as a real mother hen. I was like, all right, back the train up. Who are you going to promote, the real leader or the real mother hen? At first they were a little defensive, but then they're like, okay, all right, you're right. And they changed their language. And I think it helped them be more aware of their biases. So that's what I mean by hiring a bias buster to sit in on your hiring meeting.
I think that's so helpful. I wonder, do you mention to the underrepresented person or to anyone else about how your process works to help them feel like you are trying to intentionally overcome some structural bias?
Look, I'm always for being clear on what's happening. I think it would be a great idea. It will be awkward because you're then calling out, we have a homogeneous team. We don't have it. But it's like, it's going to be obvious to everyone. So I think it would be a great idea. It would be perhaps an act of courage, but that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
What do you think, Jason, or anything else that Kim mentioned about the hiring committee?
I don't know if we get to this, but the one thing that I think is really useful is that each person on the committee develops their perspective separate before there is a group conversation. I think it's both from a being able to identify bias perspective. It's easier when people bring a perspective that they've prepared to those conversations to start to notice patterns, because some companies that I've worked for have not been as rigorous about making sure that people who are participating in that interview panel don't influence each other's perspectives, because it's really easy for one person's bias to leak into other people's reviews of someone's performance during an interview process if you don't have some way to sort of keep them separated until it's time to have a group conversation.
Yeah, I mean, and a simple way to do that is to tell people they have to write their feedback before they come into the hiring meeting.
Yep.
And so you have a written process and then you sit down to discuss. And by the way, in the written process, you can use Textio to flag bias in your assessment.
That's good.
I know people hate to write, but I love to write. So write. Everybody has to write.
And do you just quickly want to say what Textio is for those who might not be aware?
Sure. Textio is a company that assesses your text and flags language that is biased.
I want to mention this idea that you bring up in Radical Candor, Kim, around casual interview environments. This is more in-person tips like taking candidates to lunch or walking them to cars. How have you found this has led to more candid conversations during the interview process?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that is true if you take people to lunch, which is maybe harder in this remote work environment that we're in, but noticing how people treat the waiter is a really important criteria. If you're trying to hire people who are kind and respectful, noticing also another thing that I've done is notice how they treat the recruiter or notice how they treat the receptionist. Are they polite? Are they kind? Or are they brusque and disrespectful? So I think that is good. Another thing that people reveal in casual conversation, it's sort of startling what people will say. There was one executive who would walk candidates to the car. And one time there was someone that this executive was about to hire. And on the way to the car, the candidate divulged a drug habit. Another bragged about his dominance at home with his family and said he liked to keep his women in line. Another one joked about how they like to gossip about other colleagues and clients at lunch. So those people obviously didn't get hired.
It's almost like in that different context, people maybe feel a little more safe to share what's really on their mind. Jason, have you had situations like that? Do you have any tips specifically on candid conversations, casual conversations in a virtual environment?
Yes. One company I worked for, it wasn't always a receptionist, but we had someone who was sort of assisting a person through a series of interviews who wasn't necessarily on the interview panel, but we invited them to write their own perspective. So the person who was sort of helping the person get around, the office and to various meetings and offering them water, we also had them write their experience. And that was data that we considered as part of the panel.
I love that. That's really fantastic. Kim, you had mentioned this already of just the importance of writing things down. You write in the book, Radical Candor, schedule an hour, interview for 45 minutes, and write for 15. This arrangement will force you to have a more focused interview and to make a better recommendation about whom to hire. You also just referenced sort of running that through Textio, but I wonder just the very act of kind of that forcing function of writing right after. What have you learned? Do you have any concerns about any sort of recency bias on that exercise?
Well, I mean, I don't think recency bias plays in here because you've only met this person for 45 minutes. So the reason to schedule it for only 45 minutes and to schedule the time to write is that very often, if one of the reasons why people hate to write down their interview feedback is because they wind up having to do it after work because there's not time in their day. So make sure to book time in calendar to write. And I think the kinds of things that you learn when you write down, often there'll be something bugging you about the interview, but it's hard to put your finger on what it is. And if you give yourself a little bit of time to think about it, then you will figure it out. So there was, for example, someone who I was interviewing and what he said was sort of very impressive, but I was left with this weird feeling. And when I took the time to write it down, I realized that he was just BSing. He was not giving any details and talking about scaling to infinity, which sounded good, but really didn't mean anything.
Yeah, and you've often talked about the value of writing. And I think just there might be some sense that something might be off. Again, some of that might be our own bias. Some of it might be the need for specificity. Jason, as you're reflecting on writing down, does that mirror your process? Do you have a different way that you assess what happened in your interviews?
No, but I will say that what I've noticed about writing leads into the sort of the next point here, which is usually by the time there were several times where I started with one opinion. And then as I was writing, I realized I did not agree with myself. So I might have walked out of a meeting and I had a really good feeling about this person, but that was a lot of times that's like a social thing, right? Where you're like, oh, we had a great conversation. We really flowed. It was really good. And I found that in the writing process, as I actually started to like detail out, this is what this person answered and here's how they approached it. And I'm like, oh, wait a second. Like, this is not a great, it was actually a really good way for me to force myself to consider the content of what they said and whether the content of what they said matched up with the requirements that we had for the job. Because sometimes you have a great conversation with someone who's a terrible fit for the role, but those two things can feel mixed up.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. You might really feel a resonance with this person, but if they're scaling to infinity and we actually just need someone to fill out the TPS cover sheets, we might have a misalignment. Finally, Kim, you write in the book, quote, if you're not dying to hire somebody, don't make an offer. And even if you are dying to hire somebody, allow yourself to be overruled by the other interviewers who feel strongly the person shouldn't be hired. In general, a bias toward no is useful when hiring. Tell us more about that bias towards no.
Well, I think that when you need to fill a role, there's a bunch of pressures to just grab someone because you need the work to be done and also because you're busy and you don't want to keep interviewing. And in my experience, when you hire the wrong person, having to undo that mistake takes way more time than interviewing a couple more people. So that's part of the reason for the bias to know. Also, on the first day of working with someone, if you already have questions and doubts and skepticism, it often gets worse, not better. So you really want to feel in your gut that you want to hire this person.
I think the bias toward no is useful in a lot of situations, not just hiring, but especially useful on hiring. I think to Kim's point, some of the rescinding of offers is because people may, quote unquote, be excited to have this person on board, but they're not actually sure that they really need this person. This person's the exact right fit for the role, right? Those are the offers that get rescinded first. And you could have avoided that by just saying, we haven't found the person yet. My guess is there's a lot of overlap between rescinded offers and people not being super confident that they found exactly the right person. So even if you followed all the steps and hired someone, and for reasons no one could have predicted, you have to rescind the offer, consider helping that candidate find another position. I think, like I said, that there's a high probability that this person is incredibly capable. You just may not have the ability to hire them anymore. So if they've passed your bar, no reason not to help them land a job at another organization. The Times article that will be linked in the show note describes one situation where a candidate had two offers rescinded in the same week. And the founders of both of these companies are actively using their networks to help that candidate find another position. And it feels like a kind thing to do, given that it's really not in that person's control. They did nothing wrong. It wasn't something they did that caused the offer to be rescinded.
Okay, well, now it's time for our Radical Candor checklist, tips you can use to start putting Radical Candor into practice. Tip number 1, create more casual moments in your interview. You can do this by taking candidates to lunch, walking them to the car. Jason shared a great example of bringing in your schedulers, your receptionists, other touch points in the process into your interviewing decision-making process overall to start to build out the fuller view of your candidate.
Tip number 2, schedule an hour for your interview, but use only 45 minutes for the actual interview and write for the final 15 minutes. This time will force you to take a more focused look at the interview. And as I said, you might find that you have a clearer recommendation at the end of that writing process than you did at the beginning, up to and including changing your mind about whether or not the person is a good fit. The writing time is super valuable.
Tip number 3, if you are consistently not hiring underrepresented people who have the skills for the job, it's time to look yourself in the mirror and figure out how you can take bias out of your interview process. You can be explicit about a commitment to culture adding in your job description, and you can use tools like Textio to help. For more tips, you can go to radicalcandor.com/resources to download our learning guides for practicing radical candor. Show notes for this episode, go on over to radicalcandor.com/podcast. If you like what you hear, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And if there's a career topic you'd like for us to discuss, go ahead and email us podcast@radicalcandor.com. Finally, there is still Radical Candor swag to be had. Radicalcandor.com. You can find and click the shop link, coffee mugs, magnets, notepads, and more. Bye for now. Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter @Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.